Good evening. I'm Marion Dry, Chair of ClassACT HR73, and it is my honor to welcome you to this ClassACT Forum, Press Freedom Under Assault, Preserving Our Democracy. ClassACT forums bring leaders and experts together to discuss the issues we face in this world in this challenging time. ClassACT HR73, Class Achieving Change Together, is a nonprofit organization developed in 2013 to provide members of the Harvard-Radcliffe class of 1973 and others with opportunities to work together to create positive change in the areas of justice and civic engagement, education, health, and the environment. With the aid of the Harvard Alumni Association, we have shared the ClassACT model with many Harvard classes, and now there is a vibrant ClassACT movement. To learn more about ClassACT HR73's work and impact, how you can get involved, and to see videos of our forums, please go to our website, classacthr73.org. We are a nonpartisan organization. The views and opinions expressed in this forum belong solely to the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of ClassACT HR73. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Sylvester Monroe, my friend and classmate, senior fellow at the University of Southern California, Annenberg Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy. He has reported for Newsweek and Time and served as the assistant foreign editor of the Washington Post. Sylvester, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mary. I am so excited to be here to talk about this very important subject today and to introduce our stellar panel. We are in an unprecedented, seem to be facing an unprecedented time of assault against the media and freedom of the press, individual journalists and news organizations being attacked by the government, members of the government, up to and including the President of the United States, journalists who are trying to do their jobs being attacked and assaulted in the field while they try to work. As I said, we have a distinguished panel to discuss these and how we got here, where we go from here, and what this all means, why freedom of the press is important. First member of our panel, Geoffrey Cowan, is a university professor at the University of Southern California. He's former dean of the Annenberg School. He is a distinguished First Amendment lawyer, and he ran Voice of America for more than 20 years. Our next panelist, Susan Goldberg, is president and CEO of GBH Foundation, which produces much of the content for public television and NPR stations across the country. She also is a former executive editor, editor-in-chief of National Geographic. She was editor-in-chief of the Cleveland Plain Dealer and managing editor of the San Jose Mercury News. Welcome, Susan. And finally, Kevin with ESPN and former managing editor of the Washington Post. Kevin Merida, welcome. Kevin, are you here?
Yes.
Good. As I said, I'm really excited to be here with you guys, and I'd like in the opening sessions here, if you can see my T-shirt, it says, "First they came for the journalists. After that, then we don't know what happened." And I thought that's apropos because this is supposedly, and we don't know this for sure, a German businessman back in the 1930s said this and lamented the fact that he did not speak up when journalists were being attacked in Nazi Germany. My question to each of you is, have we ever seen anything like this in the United States before at this level? And if so, how did we get here? Jeff, would you start? I mean, and put this in the context of why freedom of the press is so important.
Well, first of all, it's not just a coincidence. It's at the top of the Bill of Rights. I mean, and as your T-shirt, which by the way we maybe should be using to raise money either for ClassACT or for the press. So start marketing it. But as it says, I mean, it's essential to what people know. Interesting thing to me is that when the country started, the press wasn't what we think of it as, well, the 50s model. It didn't exist. I mean, the press in those days was very factionalized. It was basically small, of course, printing presses. None of us can quite even picture that. But the press was all paid for by political factions. So it isn't sort of the press, the Susan Goldberg, GBH press or the Washington Post press that Kevin or the LA Times once upon a time. There have been some other difficult times in our history. Many of you know Adam Hochschild. He wrote a book called American Midnight, about the period around World War I, when the press was under terrible attack. And I first became a journalist, and some of you, well, you're 10 years younger than me, but in the South in the 1960s, the press was under tremendous pressure. There were a few good papers, but basically it was very hard to have the kind of press that we'd want to have. Now, it's a regional part of the United States, but there have been bad times before. I think what makes this time different, and we'll talk about this later, is the reasons that it's happening and how hard it is to dig our way out of it.
Susan?
These things do come in waves. I certainly agree with what Jeff said. Woodrow Wilson imprisoned people who held up signs with his own words on it, protesting in front of the White House. He shut down papers. Even as recently as the administration of Barack Obama, the press people who leaked to the press were incredibly targeted. And Obama used the Espionage Act from 1917, in fact, to go after leakers. So he was widely criticized for that. He seized the phone records of 20 Associated Press reporters. He had a Fox News journalist named James Rosen. His cell phone and his emails were monitored. So there have been really tough and difficult times before. But I would say that what I think feels different to me is the sort of official stamp of enmity about the press from many quarters in this country. And it really began, I believe, during President Trump's first term, when he labeled the press the enemy of the people. And that, I believe, began us down this road where we find ourselves today.
Kevin?
Yeah, I'll just kind of, add to the catalog here that the media's faced a lot of strife and difficulty. I mean, it's just to add to the examples. I mean, McCarthy era was not a good era for journalists. With all of the red baiting and ties, accusing journalists of ties to communism and having to combat that, and some blacklisted, and in the Nixon administration, he had his enemies list. Some journalists were targeted through tax audits, and wiretaps, and so journalism has really been a resilient profession, and now it's called upon to be the most resilient in a lot of ways, because as Susan pointed out, I mean, it's more of you have really the president himself, with kind of more of a sustained kind of both not only broad use of the bully pulpit and things, he brought fake news into the lexicon, a kind of a demonization of media, right? And not only broadly, but by name, individual reporters, individual news organizations, and that's continued with lawsuits, threats of lawsuits, and he's brought others around him, not just him, but in other agencies and departments. And so it's been a lot more of a kind of maybe a sustained kind of fight, and you've seen as a result, a lot of news organizations banding together to try to combat that in ways through the courts and in other ways. The one thing I'll say, is that the journalism itself continues despite that.
So what Kevin was talking about, I wanted to follow up and ask, what can we do? What are media outlets, what are journalists doing to fight back themselves right now? Each of you.
Marty Baron, the former editor of the Washington Post, says it really well when he says, we don't go to war, we go to work. And I believe that is exactly what we need to be doing in this moment, which is documenting this time and doing so in a fair and impartial manner, and that the kind of coverage that all people will want to read, not coverage that is from one political camp or another. I think those of us in the ethical, legitimate press really want to do stories that not one side or the other wants to read, but that everybody finds useful, and to write the truth as best as we know how every single day. That's what we try to do at GBH. That's what we've tried to do at every place that I've ever worked. And this is a really tough atmosphere in which to do that. Yeah. And it is very tough to create content that people will accept as factual. But I think that is what we need to keep doing, and show your work. We have all sorts of transparency projects. We try to help people understand how we got the information, why we reported it the way we did. There's all kinds of tools we've got at our disposal that we didn't used to have. And we need to use all of them to try to create stories that are believable and will be believed.
I think what Susan says is very important. We also have to be able to protect our profession and our freedoms through the courts as well. And I think you have a lot of offers of pro bono help from legal firms, because a lot of places don't have the resources as some of the big places. They don't have in-house counsel. Certainly there's a committee to protect journalists, and there are others. And I think there has been that sense that we have a profession that's in the Constitution and needs protection, and there's a lot of effort to do that. But I'll say this, the other thing, I don't think that we can be not responsible in building trust. That's on us in our profession, right? If people have problems with us, and clearly a lot of the polling and surveying show that we're rated lowly, and it's not the first time that's happened either, but that's on us to kind of build that trust. And part of it is what Susan says, transparency, letting people know how we do our work, being open, publishing the documents, letting people see the work, taking questions, not ducking them, telling people, explaining how we use anonymous sources, why we do it, when we do it. And also I think, and I know you'll get into this later, I think going really in local communities where news organizations exist, and really being rooted in the community, and building it and being part of what is going on in communities. And so not having always such a long lens in the distance. And I think it's a big part of regaining trust in our profession.
I think part of what's interesting is that the press is changing. And so the press that we all know, which was, broadcast news, print news, the major papers, GBH, which by the way wasn't there forever, but GBH, public broadcasting, Kevin, the papers that you were part of, that's not who my students are getting where they're getting their news at all anymore. I mean, I read it, but they're not. But many people our age are not getting the news any longer from those places. Those places are in trouble. We can talk about where that is later if you want, Pascal. I think it's interesting what's happened to the economics of journalism, and then what's happened to the people who supposedly were to bail it out, and turns out that they have other interests. But people are getting the news in new ways, and it'd be interesting to ask, have the members of the people watching this ask themselves where they're getting their news. How many are on Substack? While I'm talking, just a little across my screen flashed.
You're fading again, Jeff.
Yeah. Today's Substack column from Dan Rather. That's what Dan Rather's doing. What did Terry Moran do when he was fired by ABC? He's on Substack. How many people have podcasts? I mean, there are all kinds of, and for young people, they're on, my students this year are on TikTok. A few years ago, they were on Facebook. By the way, for those of you interested in this, Today, in Axios, if any of you read Axios, another relatively new news outlet that I personally read every day, but they had a chart a few years ago. Remember when everybody was on X or Twitter? Then along came Threads. Today, Threads has basically caught up with X, or what was Twitter. Blue Sky, this chart has it, is still below that, but it's another new source of news and information. And you're urging people to watch this on Blue Sky. That didn't exist a while ago. So I think there's an evolving way in which people are getting their news and information, many of it through people who previously worked for publications of the kind that we all respected so much, but now are using those outlets.
Well, and a lot of the publications also publish across a wide, have to and want to publish across a wide variety of platforms, including places like GBH or the Washington Post or the LA Times, using all of the tools to reach the widest possible, most diverse audience that you can reach.
So these don't necessarily have to be a threat to mainstream media.
They should be the savior of mainstream media, frankly.
I'd like to move now to some specific questions that sort of bore in a little bit on these assaults and make sense of them. Susan, I'd like to start with you. These assaults on threats to cut funding to public broadcasting are serious and ongoing. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means for your world and what public broadcasting and outlets like NPR and so on are doing about it?
Sure. Look, there have been threats to defund public media for the last 50 years. I think every Republican administration for the last 50 years has threatened to defund public media. This is by far, no question, the most serious threat that has the highest likelihood of passage. In fact, the Senate subcommittee is going to start voting on, we think, Tuesday about the rescission package that the administration has put before it. This is a package that has already passed in the House of Representatives that would claw back $1.1 billion Congress has already appropriated for public media. Public media has always been funded 2 years in advance, and they did that so that public media wasn't affected by the winds of political change at any one moment. So they are trying to claw back money that Congress has already appropriated, beginning for fiscal 26 and fiscal 27. Fiscal 26 begins October 1st, like practically tomorrow. And so if this happens, this is going to be a devastating blow for public media across the United States. It will affect programming. It will affect emergency broadcasting. It will affect the ability to create children's television. And I could go on and on. So defunding, though, is just one of the threats by the administration. There's also, an attempt to derail us from an ability to make a living. The administration sicked the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, on NPR and PBS, saying we were not following the rules for sponsorship. They're saying that our sponsorship, our writing, our underwriting is more like advertising. In fact, we follow the rules that the FCC laid out, but there is this investigation that is ongoing. So they're trying to defund us, derail our ability to, make a living, and also to delegitimize the content we create. I don't know if you saw a few months ago, I think it was in March, a hearing before Marjorie Taylor Greene's DOJ subcommittee that hauled Paula Kerger, the head of PBS, and Catherine Marr, the head of NPR, in front of her to talk about the supposedly biased content both sides of public media were creating. There were a lot of defenders of public media in that room too, but a lot of people who just decided that this content is biased and is not worthy of support. So those are the threats that are going on, and they are extremely serious.
Can we help people to understand how important you mentioned? I think of PBS and NPR. My kids grew up on Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers. How can these things be? You wonder how they can come under attack. And what happens if we don't have them anymore?
Well, Look, so I'll just talk about, so we're a dual licensee, meaning we
Yeah.
operate on the television side and on the radio side. There's other outlets that are just on the radio side and some that are just on the television side. But at GBH, we're the largest creator of content for PBS. So we create, 5 big television shows, everything from Frontline, a documentary, television show that does incredible investigative work, to Antiques Roadshow, right? One of the most popular shows on PBS, and a lot of other stuff in between. So what happens if we are defunded? Well, immediately at GBH, 8% of our budget just goes away, the money that we directly get from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But for a lot of stations all over the country, that 8%, especially small stations, especially in rural areas, 8% of public funding might be more like 20% or 30% or 40%. And those stations all over the country are going to get into real trouble. They're not going to be able to pay dues to PBS, which means PBS won't be able to give us the $50 million a year they give us to produce all of that programming. So you're going to see this funding situation wash through a very complicated kind of circular public media system, and you're going to see programming shrink. Already money for children, for the development of educational children's television has been cut off by the administration. The grants came out of the Department of Education, and they have been canceled already.
The story yesterday that Indiana Public Broadcasting is totally, could you explain what has happened in Indiana?
So I think Indiana, if I have, don't, I know there's a lot of people on this call, don't hold me to this, but I believe that Indiana has like 17 different public media outlets, and they have a lot of state funding too. The state has completely canceled the state funding for Indiana public media, and now they're in danger, of course, if this rescission happens, for losing all their federal funding as well. So we're going to see a system under real incredible stress if the federal funding is cut off in a place like Indiana.
Jeff, could you talk about, in this context, explain to people, everybody doesn't know what Voice of America is, but can you talk about what Voice of America is, why, and explain the assaults that are now, that Voice of America, the cuts that it's undergoing, the assault on it, and what it means not to have, what it would mean not to have Voice of America?
Thanks, Justin. I feel quite passionate about this. My dad was the second director of Voice of America in World War II. It started as an opposition to Hitler's propaganda. Started with 4 languages. When I left there, which was the Clinton years, we had 53 languages. It's now broadcast until it started to be cut off in the last few weeks. It was broadcasting in something like 45 languages. Voice of America has about 350 million listeners around the world, but the law prohibits us from broadcasting domestically in the United States. But about 350 million people around the world rely on Voice of America in all the languages. And the power of it is incredible. I mean, there were hearings last week. The current kind of person trying to close it down at the instruction of the administration is Carrie Lake, whose name will be familiar to a lot of people online. Well, there was a hearing last week, and one of the people who was a Congress member there said the following, and this you can actually probably watch somewhere online. But he was from a district where there were a lot of Armenians. And by the way, it's true for the language services of every one of the language services. Doesn't have to be true with the story I'm about to tell you in Liberia, because they speak, as you know, English in Liberia. But so he said in Armenia, he said a third of the people in Armenia listen to the Armenian service, the Voice of America. Armenia is under threat from Russia. If you didn't have a Voice of America Armenian service, Russia would control totally the media there. So he said to her, you charge her with us with, by the way, he said, what language do you think they speak in Armenia? She said, why not? He said, Armenian. Anyway, but she was charging with waste, fraud, and abuse. She said, do you know how many people are in that service that reaches a third of the people in Armenia, which is under assault by Russia? 5 people. And those 5 people who were are Armenian speakers from Armenia mainly, who are many of them being reporting from Armenia. But those 5 people are reaching a third of the people in that country, and now they're not on the air at all. And that's true around the world. In Africa, we have 16 languages reaching 100 million people. For many of them, we're the lifeline, the Voice of America is. Anyway, they've decided to cut it off entirely. And unlike public broadcasting, where there are other sources of funds, the only source of funding is the U.S. government. And they're talking about, they've announced they're cutting it off. Now, we keep having court decisions. We'll talk about this later. Court decisions keep stopping them from cutting it off because the money's been appropriated. But they keep cutting it off, and then they keep losing in court. Everybody who's worked for Voice America is now on what's called administrative leave, meaning they're being paid, but they're not working. The distribution services we were on, like, Susan was talking about the distribution services that GBH is on, they've all been bought up by the Chinese. So our distribution services have taken over by other countries. But there's a fight going on, and I think there's a possibility that the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the Asia Pacific Network or Radio Free Asia and Middle Eastern Broadcast, Middle Eastern Broadcasting Company, just in Arabic, reaches 30 million people. Why was it set up? To be a counterpoint to Al Jazeera. Who owns Al Jazeera? The government of Qatar. What did Qatar just give to the President of the United States? A $400 million plane. And they eliminated in the process, I'm not saying it's quid pro quo, but it's sort of interesting. They eliminated any competition for Al Jazeera. There's now no Radio Free, no Middle Eastern Broadcast Network broadcast. Anyway,
how much of this, go ahead, and this is for you as well, Susan. How much of these assaults are, I mean, some of them seem to make no sense to me, but what is the agenda, do you think, of the people who are actually doing this? Why would they want public broadcasting to end? Why would they want to make media the enemy of the people? Why would they want no voice of America? Any of you, I'd love to hear why you think, because sometimes I say, this makes absolutely no sense.
I mean, I can't get into the minds and the hearts of everybody, but I think it's been pretty transparent. We started with this with the Trump administration, and you start with the president. I mean, he doesn't have a good really believe in the media. And so, a lot of times journalism tells uncomfortable truths, and people don't want those uncomfortable truths told. And so, it has appeal with certain parts of voters in certain places, and maybe it's base, and so some of it can be political, but it starts with not really believing that the media's role is advantageous, to the people in power. And so I think you can extrapolate from there. And and I think it's fairly transparent, as we've talked about, because we see from the bully pulpit the constant stream of whenever there's something negative written or not favorable to the administration, there will be shots at the media.
How much of this has to do with the current structure of ownership of much of? You have worked at the Washington Post when it was owned by an independent family, the Graham family. And you've worked at the Washington Post after after business mogul Jeff Bezos took over. You also became executive editor of the Los Angeles Times under Patrick Soon-Shiong, a huge, very rich entrepreneur, businessman in California. How much of that is a factor in the vulnerability of news organizations? I mean, go ahead.
Well, there have always been different models and different ownership. And we've had what people describe really beloved owners of places, and I would say the Graham family is among the most beloved. And we've had, before, mega billionaires like Jeff Bezos took over, and Patrick Soon-Shiong is also a billionaire, big billionaire, wealthiest man in LA, as the reports have said. Not as big a billionaire as Jeff Bezos, but we've also had hedge funds. We've had lots of different people own media, and we've had some good experiences and some horrible experience. And so I don't ascribe it just to this. There's certainly been some decisions that have been made by the two that you mentioned, right? And it got a lot of attention. Jeff Bezos was starting with not allowing endorsement of a presidential in the presidential race this year. Same with Patrick Soon-Shiong and other decisions that have to do with the opinion sections of those two news organizations that really got a lot of attention, a lot of criticism. Both of those places lost, um, subscriptions, and people left, and a lot of things happened. I'll say this though, that the journalism itself, the core things that those news organizations are known for, continued. There's still been tremendous reporting at the Washington Post, despite whatever view of Jeff Bezos has changed. And I'll say, when Jeff Bezos came in, he saw the place, was curious. I was there when he bought it. Gave famously runway and invested a lot, built the newsroom up. I mean, he was admired, and he was a hero. And democracy dies in darkness, and so there was a lot that he did that people applauded, and I was one of those that applauded. And so Patrick, same. I'll say that, and you know this, Vest, because you've been in LA. I mean, had a lot of string of difficult ownership. The LA Times was cut to the bone, lost a lot of its luster, demoralized staff, a very limited staff. Patrick Soon-Shiong came in, built it up, spent a lot of money, bought it and invested a lot. And that's one of the things he would say. And now we've gone back the other way, where a lot of layoffs. It's a very hard business, to make money on right now.
Yeah.
But it's also a very unique business. And sometimes we don't think about that, right? Like, what other business where we ask the owners, don't interfere, you know? Imagine someone, you have a soft drink business, or, a clothing line, and you say, don't interfere with the product. And that's essentially what is asked of that ownership there. And for the most part, all of the owners we admire don't do that. They don't
Yeah.
interfere. They're there for a different purpose. And so when they do interfere and they hop in, it gets a lot of attention because that's not what's expected. I'll say the most important thing, I think, is that, journalism is undefeated. And I say that because no matter what the ownership, no matter the times, journalists manage to do the work. Some of the greatest journalism is happening now. It really is. And we're going to look back, and we're going to see people will say this is a tremendous period where journalists are doing the hard work. And they're doing it at those places. The coverage of the fires, some of the coverages of I've been watching of what's happening on the streets of LA and other places with ICE raids and stuff. LA Times has been very, very good at a lot of that work. And the Washington Post, when it comes to the Trump administration and the president himself, and the enterprise and the investigation reporting, it's been terrific. I'll pivot from to give props to a billionaire that actually deserves it, which is Stuart Boehner, which is took something in a place where there had been a news organization, the Baltimore Sun, very well respected over time, had been in decline, started, from scratch. One of the new kind of local news organizations invested in it, built it up. They won a Pulitzer Prize for local reporting this past year. And I've talked to Stuart many times. I bet you Susan has too. Because what Stuart does is he calls you. Every time I've been around Stuart, um, he takes notes, he has questions, he's curious. And I think that's the most important quality I like to see in anybody who owns it. If it's not your core business, to be curious about it, and because it's a complicated business. And Stewart, every time I'm around another leader in our industry, Susan, and I was talking to Dean Baquet last week, and he was talking about Stewart calling him, and asking a question. I said, by the way, Stewart had just called me, and so I think it's not the fact that you're a billionaire, right? That alone does not make you great for our profession or not. It's just I think you need to have curiosity and a kind of commitment to understand the history of journalism and what our unique it's a unique business.
Let's talk a little bit about all of us about the impact of a case like a lawsuit is brought by the president of the United States against 60 Minutes for editing an interview with Kamala Harris, something that is clearly, clearly within the bounds of what news organizations do. News organizations are permitted to edit interviews for length and whatnot. I mean, it's clearly transparent. He files a lawsuit, and the ownership of CBS agrees to pay $16 million to the Trump administration. Morale at 60 Minutes is just in the toilet. And what it brings me back to is that you remember when we were cub journalists, cub reporters, and we talked about the firewall between the enterprise and the newsroom that allowed us to do our jobs. What does a decision like this at CBS do? Not just to the morale, people are resigning. I'd like to hear from all of you how serious that sort of thing is.
It has something in common with what happened with Patrick Schuschong and what happened with Jeff Bezos, which is these are all enterprises that in one owned by people who need the government to do something with them in another area. So Patrick Schuschong is rich because he wants his patents approved, something like that, by the FDA. That's basically true, Kevin, something like that. And Bezos is funding the Washington Post because he relies on all kinds of benefits, including for his space operations, from the US government. And CBS, they want to sell it now, and they have to get approvals from the government. And what Trump has done that I think is terribly dangerous, brilliant in its own horrible way, which he's figured out a way to use the levers of power to squeeze these people to do this. And people leave some of these organizations. But I basically think that Kevin's right, that as horrible as this is, and as much as he squeezed things, they're continuing to do great journalism, and I think they will at CBS too.
I guess I would just add, it's stuff like this, though, that breeds terrible cynicism among the public, right? I mean, forgetting for a moment what it does to the journalists inside the organization, it just sets off such distrust in the public that you can't believe anything because it's all a setup, it's all a put up, it's all for sale. And like you, Jeff and Kevin, I don't believe it is all for sale either. And I think there is great journalism going on. But what really frightens me about this is the message that it sends. Look, you've always had throughout history, and Kevin, you mentioned this, good and bad owners. You know, I worked for a newspaper company for many years called Knight Ridder. I was incredibly proud to work for Knight Ridder, you know, very proud of the newspapers that we did. There was another company I worked for, Gannett. You know, they squeezed the heck out of the papers, you know, in many cases. You know, I worked for them too. I worked for Fox when Fox bought National Geographic, and everybody said, "Oh my God, is Rupert Murdoch gonna make you put a climate denier story on the cover of National Geographic?" And of course, the answer was no. But so there's always complications with the ownership. But what I don't really recall is the kind of is the accumulation of distrust that's coming from a string of these kinds of decisions, and it just undermines people's faith.
Just to add on to what Susan said, I mean, I think with the example you used to CBS, there's that sense that you can get capitulation by threat, you know, and you can force it, you know, and use the levers of government to make someone cow because they need something, as Jeff alluded to. They need something from the ghetto government, and you can use that power to get what you want and bend it to will. I think in our profession, we've always thought that people are willing to go to jail. Literally, in journalism, people really have lost their lives. They've taken on some of the most difficult stories. They've gone into places that you couldn't get into, and they would go to jail for the sources, and so there was this sense that our profession would rise above any effort to intimidate. And in newsrooms, that is pretty much the case. I can tell you, like, it's very hard to intimidate a journalist inside a newsroom, but the chill part is, as Susan, that's what, when you see these kinds of things, it does have a chilling effect across the board beyond simply the journalists. And that's probably the new disturbing thing.
So it seems to me that what we need to do is find a way, two things, to ensure, regardless of who owns the media organization, the integrity and independence of newsrooms. And I guess what we're seeing is that that's not always easy.
Well, look, it's obviously not easy, but there are things that newsrooms can do. We talked briefly at the start about transparency. CBS could have saved itself 16 million bucks if they had done what Frontline does with every single program, which is to publish all the outtakes all the time. It's just the way they do business, right? Of course, you have to edit for clarity, for time or space. If there's an editor function that is completely important, and it makes the work more understandable. But we publish all the outtakes all the time, and it's just the way they do business at Frontline, and it really helps build trust rather than undermine trust.
Jeff, I want to come back to you before we move to the next segment, because we also wanted to, I think if it's not a direct assault on freedom of the press, is what's happening with the demise of local news.
First of all, I think maybe Susan alluded to this earlier. The reason people trust the news media largely is local news, because they know if somebody died in their community, if there was a wedding in their community, what happened in the high school football game. When those things are being reported on, people know the truth. And local news also achieves an accountability function that's incredibly important. There are studies that show that bond ratings are lower. It costs less to borrow for in communities where there's local news media, because they keep people accountable. So there are all kinds of reasons why local media is incredibly important for building trust and for communities. And it's dying for the reasons that are the economic reasons that are happening to the press generally, which is that the old economic base of the press of advertising, my first job was for the Danbury News Times. Nobody's ever heard of it here. But my job as a 16-year-old was to do the listings in that part of Connecticut for what stations you could get television shows on. Well, nobody gets the papers for that now. People on this call will remember when classified advertising had to be in the newspapers. And so I think the LA Times, Kevin, you can tell me if I'm right, but I think at one time the LA Times had a net plus of something like $300 million a year that came from classified advertising. And you didn't need reporters to do it. Is that right, Kevin? Something like $300 million?
I think even more than that, but I'll let you continue. Go ahead.
And that all ended, and I don't blame Craig Newmark, who I think is a great guy, but Craigslist, kind of somebody else would have done it. That ended with him. Now you have Fandango or something to know where to go to the movies. So it's no longer the case. And by the way, every technology that's going to change with, but it's changed. And so local papers don't have that funding. And I think something like 2,500 local papers have died. A few people have done great jobs. You mentioned the Baltimore Banner. I personally love Mississippi Today, which is a privately funded enterprise and also on a Pulitzer, Texas Tribune. But they're not local in the sense you're talking about local. And we need that local news. So at our little enterprise, which Sylvester, you and I are both connected with, what we try to do is get thinking of high school and college journalists. And can they fill a little of that space? Which I think maybe they can. It's a little like having a local theater company made up the kids who do theater in college or in high school. But I think there's a little bit of the space that can be filled there. But it's a tough road to hoe, and I think local journalism is in real trouble. And with the death of public broadcasting and public radio, it's incredible. Lisa Murkowski gave a very good talk about, though she voted ultimately bill. She gave a very good talk about what public radio means for people around the state in Alaska, because it's the only place they get news.
Well,
it's the only emergency warning.
I mean, and the more far-flung, more remote place, the more it really matters. Having those local voices really matter, and those are the ones that are endangered. But I agree with you, Jeff, that look, I think local news is trusted news, and it might not always be liked, or people sometimes hate their local paper a lot, but at least they know where to complain, and at least they know who to yell at. I mean, when I was the editor of the San Jose Mercury News, I remember I was grocery shopping, somebody yelling at me across the tomatoes about something that was on the front page. Once when I was the editor of the Plain Dealer, I was at the gym doing sit-ups on the floor, and some man came and stood over me and yelled at me about what was in the paper. Okay, it wasn't fun, but it's really important that people at least know what you can do to try to make a difference or get your voice heard. It is so different from sort of screaming into the void of national programming. It really matters.
Is there a Plain Dealer any longer?
Yes, there's still a Plain Dealer, but there are also several nonprofit Cleveland papers that have risen up because the Plain Dealer has shrunk down to almost nothing. So a bunch of the papers or a bunch of the news outlets that we've been talking about here are nonprofit organizations. They're not public media, but they're not local nonprofits. And that is an important business model that has risen up.
Yeah, that's where I wanted to go, just as another note to the local media ecosystem, is that it's changed. I mean, you made the things about newspapers. I think Northwestern University had the study of 2.5 newspapers a week are dying, but that's a function of consumption habits, and I think what audiences are saying, because what the digital era has created kind of a proliferation of a lot of different kinds of news operations, and not so much general interest. People are not coming for big general interest news organizations. Not many of those can survive, and certainly not in the big cities for lots of reasons. And so in its place have been a lot of nonprofit new media institutes. They're not huge, as big as the local newspapers, but some of them are doing tremendous work. You mentioned some of places like Block Club, Chicago. Um, we mentioned the Banner. We even in LA, where there's an attempt to put together a collaborative under the local LA Local News Initiative, Boyle Heights Beat. Very community centric, hyper local, focused on Boyle Heights, that historic Latino community, and East LA, and I think you're seeing that model of hyper local and niche places grow up across the country, and that's a very promising thing, because they're serving communities and they're attracting an audience.
Kevin, didn't you or aren't you involved with a group that's helping to fund those local programs?
Yeah, I mean, it's under the umbrella right now, the LA Local News Initiatives, nonprofit, kind of, like I said, a collaborative that's part of the American Journalism Project, which has something like 53 or something nonprofit. They fund anyway, 53, or I think that's the number, across the country. But I think it's growing. People are saying, look, where can I find traction? You take a place like the LA Public Press. They do accountability journalism, probably like 6 reporters, and they serve a purpose. And I think that's more of the model for local journalism. No one's going to create another LA Times, or I would say another Dallas Morning News, or take your pick in a big city. They're going to do other things that find an audience that may be smaller, and fill the gap of being really community centered.
What can we do? And I would start by saying that, and I think most of you will agree, is to support your local news organization, newspaper, um, NPR station, um, uh, join the public broadcasting station, and so forth. But I'd like to hear from each of you. What can ordinary people do in the middle of this sort of crisis?
Many of you know Jen Rubin, who was a columnist for the Washington Post and is now with one of these new groups called The Contrarian. And you'll all remember the episode when Trump said to Zelensky, "You have no cards." And then he suddenly had all those drones that he could shoot into Russia. And she wrote a column in which she said that lawsuits are the equivalent in this era, can be the equivalent of drones. And so something I believe in is, and I'm sure there are many lawyers on this, listening to this podcast, this part of this program, could think about what could they do as lawyers to make a difference. And there's a lot that they can do.
I'll go. I would say don't take a free and independent press for granted. I mean, we are in a really troubling place, and I'm not just talking about public media. This happens to be on the front burner right at this second, but these are urgent issues. Whatever kind of independent press we're talking about, it's under threat. It's under threat financially. Places are getting sued out of existence, wrongly in many cases. We've got these issues at the federal government with the attack on the VOA, the attack on public media. So I think that this has all been happening, and there's like little bursts of outrage about it, but there isn't a sustained drumbeat of people saying, hey, this really matters. This matters to our Constitution. This matters to our democracy. I don't mean to sound like, some really, impossible person that nobody wants to listen to, but gosh, it really matters. And I wish there was a way that we were better at telling our own story. We have kind of sucked at telling our own story about why it matters. We need to get better at it. And then finally, I would say, let the Senate know. I'm not telling you what to tell the Senate, but if you've got an opinion about this, you should let lawmakers on both sides of the aisle know. We've got a delegation here in Massachusetts. They are all in supporting public media. That's not who you need to reach. You need to reach the red state lawmakers who actually will determine the outcome of this vote.
Yeah, I could just plus one and plus two what Jeff and Susan said. I think complacency is probably one of our struggles as a nation. I mean, we've had such a long stretch of, you take the Constitution for granted. A lot of people don't even really know what's in it and what are the rights, of assembly and freedom of the press and freedom of speech and freedom of religion. We need to have a lot more of coming back to civic education and really comparing ourselves to the rest of the world more, because you can develop a level of complacency. You just don't believe something bad will happen here because for the most part, we can talk about we don't like our government, we this person or that person, but our institutions have mostly worked. There've been orderly, peaceful transfers of power. Obviously, there've been protests and sometimes violence. We saw what happened January 6th, but mostly it's been stability, right? And sustained stability, and it can lead to complacency sometime. Technology has been our friend. It's been a great friend. It allows us to do our work better, allows everybody. But it's also lots of dangers that are embedded into it with disinformation and misinformation, and that's one of the struggles. And I'd say what people can do is to really find the credible sources of information. I mean, in journalism that you can really trust because it's needed more than ever because there's just so much out there that's just flat out hot garbage, and people are willfully uh, misdirecting people and under the guise of, you know, whether it's ideology or, alternative stuff, but people intentionally misleading and finding whatever and supporting the sources of credible information is very important. obviously, as Susan said, I mean, where there's injustice, however you choose to speak out on it, things that are right, speak out on it, and to say the most obvious thing is voting, right? That's still a great power in this country.
I totally agree. I think that part of the reason we are where we are is that people have taken for granted um, this these freedoms. Um, whether it's freedom of the press, freedom of speech. I mean, they say it's in the Constitution, and therefore you get to where we are, and people go, how could this happen here? It's happened here because people are not engaged, because they don't understand, as people have pointed out, they don't understand how freedom of the press works, how what it is. And so I would say, as a last call to action, learn as much as you can about how, I mean, Kevin mentioned this, civic education, learn, how things work, how we fit into it, how you can make a difference. The more you know, the better it is for all of us, I think. We have some questions from the audience. Jason is asking, what strategies can journalists use to cover the Trump administration? He's talking about White House press corps, local newsrooms. I mean, is there something, I mean, these are unusual kind of times. And I think what he's asking is, are there special things or different things we need to cover an administration like the Trump administration?
I know there's been a lot of critique of whether or not it's been good or bad at this. I think probably the thing I think about is don't get distracted. I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that the president said, a lot of actions. Go dig into those things, interrogate them, find out who's responsible, like stay focused, the impact in the country. And sometimes don't get distracted by like things that seem the most outrageous quote of the day, the crazy thing that's been said from the bully pulpit, or this place or that place. But there's a lot that really institutionally, the changing nature of the federal government, which is huge. What they're trying to remake the government as, and these things need sustained kind of coverage and interrogation and rigor, and that's what I say is stay focused, and not get distracted.
Can I just add one thing to that? And I agree, Kevin, with every single thing you said. I wish there had been more of that sustained focus, rigor, and, investigative determination on the Biden administration as well. So it isn't just covering Trump. It's hard. It's hard to cover the presidency, right? There's a lot of, there's so much pushback. It's so difficult for individuals, but we just, it is becoming clearer and clearer that the coverage of the, last several years of the Biden administration didn't really live up to what it should have done either.
And by the way, if it had been better, we might not have a Trump administration. I mean, that's part of why you need good journalism. But let me add one more thing, Sylvester, in here, because in a way, it's sort of my hobby horse about the law. Discovery, and if you can get a libel case, for example, and get information through the courts, it's fantastic. And if you can sue people suing people in the government is complicated, but if you can find ways to use the law for lawsuits against the government, where information becomes public, which right now, unfortunately, we're not getting out of the like through Congress, it can be incredible, and that's what I'm involved in efforts to do that. But again, I'd urge your colleagues on this call to think about what can they do to use the courts to force discovery out of the government, so you really find out what's going on.
We have another question from Richard Day in the audience. Is what advice would the panel give to journalism educators on how to train young journalists for the future, for the journalists of the future? As we said, our business is changing. And how do we prepare them? I think we'll start with you, Jeff. That's what you're still doing.
Well, a couple of things that we're doing at our school, I think all schools are. You've got to learn. I'm sure that Susan, you're seeing this. Kevin, you did. The technologies, the techniques of journalism keep improving. At the same time, we're talking about all the other stuff. you have to know how to use the new journalism. An example would be the New York mayor's race that just happened. I mean, Cuomo and all kinds of billionaires were buying time on stations that nobody was watching, and Mamie was using new media. Well, journalists need to learn to do that. They also need to learn the new techniques for investigative journalism. There's all of these ways in which now you can learn so much from investigative journalism, and so you're trying to train all the old skills, great engaging storytelling, accuracy, balance, all of that kind of thing. But at the same time, you're teaching them the new skills that make journalism engaging to newer audiences and make it possible to use the new technologies to get the information that we really need to have.
I agree with that. This is like the golden age of journalism, I think, because there are so many ways, so many different means to reach different audiences. So you could use all of the tools, but you've got to do so with the most old-fashioned values, right? Fairness, accuracy, approaching something with an open mind, presenting both sides, properly framing your story. So you can use whatever tool you want. But I think if you don't understand really how to go about reporting a story, it's never going to be good, no matter what tool you use.
We have another question from Diana, and it's if we could recommend, she's asking if we could recommend some credible news sources. Who, I guess she's asking who out there that we can trust, who we think are good sources of news.
Can I focus that question by asking Kevin and Susan, where do you turn for your news?
Yeah. It's funny. I used to read a lot of newspapers, and I still. So I read the New York Times still. I read the Guardian still. I go. I like the BBC still. I still do NPR. I still do, and I still love public broadcasting. I learn a lot of things that I don't. I still read my. I got very angry after what Patrick Soon-Chung did and Jeff Bezos did, and I canceled my subscriptions to the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. Then I decided that doesn't really help because they don't care, and I need to support those newsrooms. They, as I think has been said, the Washington Post and the LA Times still do really good journalism. But I would suggest even there are those, but I would suggest wherever you live, support that local news outlet. But other guys aren't suggestions for what people should.
No, I think you find some of the places, there are not many. There are only a few national places left, right? I mean, and you mentioned them. I mean, and they all have value. I think let's say the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the wire services, Reuters, and Associated Press, very solid, broad. They cover everything, right? And then you get down to the places where you live, and I know this is Harvard, but I mean, not everybody's in Boston, but it's the Boston Globe and WGBH, where Susan is, and and WBR, and the places that are there are very good. They're reliable. You can trust them, and you can go at the various locations. I think some of it. I think the way the media, the ecosystem is moving, that some people do some things very well, and because everyone is not doing general interest. And so, I think in my community, LA Taco, when it comes to the raids and what's been going on in the immigrant communities, man, they've been very good. And so there are a lot of places that you can find the trusted, I think interrogate your local wherever your community is, and I bet you there's somebody that's good there.
I totally agree with that. You gotta, sort of love the ones you're with. But the only other thing I'd add is sometimes I go seek out sources that I don't think are gonna be trustworthy because I want to see how they're covering something. So I want to understand what other people are seeing who maybe aren't reading the New York Times or the Boston Globe or, looking at GBH News or Frontline. I want to go to some other places to see how they covered the same headlines.
Where are you going, Susan, for that?
I would rather not actually say.
I just came back from Martha's Vineyard, which is our other home. There may be even people on the call who are in the vineyard right now, for all I know, not so far from Harvard, from Cambridge anyway. But there are 2 newspapers on Martha's Vineyard. And one of them, you probably know, several of you, Charlie Sennett, great international correspondent. Charlie now runs the local newspaper, one of the 2 local newspapers in Martha's Vineyard, called the Martha's Vineyard Times. And he's doing a fantastic job. And the importance of the local stories that he's got are incredible. And it just reminded me the last 3 weeks that I was there, how important it is and how interesting it is to read your local community and how much all of us should be supporting that local press.
We have a question from Ellen Bowditch in North Carolina. What are journalists doing to help the public know what is true and what is false?
It's a hugely important topic. And it's going to be harder and harder to know because artificial intelligence is going to make it so that everything will be blurred. But just among the things that's been cut by this administration are the instruments of government used to help us understand what was true and wasn't false.
Wait, Jeff, what did you say? What was cut?
The administration used to have a major program that was about how disinformation was being spread by international actors in this country, which is where a lot of disinformation comes from. That's been eliminated. That part of the federal government that was trying to combat mis and disinformation. So, for example, we're living in Los Angeles. I'm in Los Angeles now. 3 of us in Los Angeles. There were huge fires in Los Angeles. There were stories being spread in Los Angeles that the fires were being spread because all the equipment had gone to Ukraine. Where do you think those stories came from? That was being spread by Russian disinformation sources. It's just an example. The fires started just before Trump came into office. And so the part of the administration that combated this immediately found the sources and tried to combat them.
There's a question, Nancy from is asking, what motivated, so when you mentioned that it's not just Trump going after people, she wants to know what motivated Obama to go after people. Was it a result of faulty intel? Was he, do we know?
I mean, I think they were, look, I can't read anybody's mind and I'd have to go refresh myself with stories from the time, but I think they were really pissed about how many leaks were just happening. I mean, Kevin, maybe help me remember here. So they decide, and this, it was some stories around Al-Qaeda, I believe. And so they decided to really crack down because they thought that these were really dangerous stories. But it was a pretty significant, I think the New York Times, I wrote down a quote from the New York Times, did an editorial about it. It said the Obama administration went from protecting government secrets, went beyond protecting government secrets to threatening fundamental freedoms of the press to gather news. And so, it was felt like there was a real line crossed at that time. And I think it did involve stories around national security.
The name somebody like Jim Risen, is that who? Somebody wrote an article. James
Rosen. There was also Jim Risen from the New York Times. Yeah.
One of them wrote an article just as Obama was about to come to power. And he said, as Trump did, he said, if Trump goes after the press, blame Obama. And he had a whole series of examples about how Obama had gone after the press on national security reasons, but he had done all kinds of things at that point didn't seem right.
Fred Adair is saying that Trump has normalized lying as news. There's been a lot of talk about how major media, New York Times, Washington Post, have submitted to that. Any thoughts about how well the media are dealing with, I mean, falsehoods that come from the Oval Office.
I don't agree with the premise of the question, honestly. From at least from the big players, I think that there is a ton of fact checking going on. You know, you get what Trump said, and then there's two sentences right under it saying that this is actually not true or this is only partially true. I think there is a ton of fact checking going on. Look, there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of disinformation, and I'm sure some stuff does get through, but I don't remember any time in the past where I have seen as much correction of facts that are put out there.
How do you
go ahead?
I'd love to know how Susan and Kevin, when he was editor, characterize Trump's statements which you know to be untrue. What's the right way to do it? Do you call them lies? Do you call them misstatements? How do you do it? I have my own perspective on this, but I'd love to know for each of you, how do you characterize it?
Well, I don't, I don't remember specifically with, you have to go with very specific examples, but I think the main thing, we get caught up in so much the language of whether you have to call something a lie or whether it's untruth, the adjectives. It's mainly making sure that the audience knows when something is not true, and making sure that that when you have the correct information that you point out, here's what the president said, but this is what really is actually accurate. And I think that's the main thing, however you do it. There are plenty of opinion. That's why we got opinion. And opinion is a dominant thread in journalism. A lot of those the new platforms you talk about, Jeff, Substack, is filled with opinion. It's mostly opinion. And so we have a lot of people calling lies or make characterizations and doing that. But I think the main thing is to make sure that in the most credible way that you can, like do the reporting, do the fact checking, as Susan said. And I think people are good at pointing out when there are inaccuracies.
I agree. I think we got way too caught up in what you call the bad thing. And instead, tell me what's right. Tell me what is true. Don't waste all your time arguing you called it an untruth or you called it a lie or you didn't go far enough. Just tell me what is right. I mean, that's really what our job is.
I agree with both of you, but for maybe a reason that would surprise people. A lie is a statement of something you know to be untrue. I personally think Trump doesn't know these things to be untrue. I think he believes things to be true that aren't true. I think that's who Trump is in most of these cases. And so it doesn't help to call it a lie, or it's maybe not even accurate to call it a lie. It's just not right.
Frank Clement is asking something you mentioned early on. You talked about how attacks on public threats to defund public media are not, and he wants to know why has there been for 50 years attacks to, attempts to defund public media, attacks on public media.
Marjorie Taylor Greene said something very interesting in the Doge hearing. It was her last line and it was her most effective. And she was criticizing the coverage out of NPR in particular as being biased. And she said at the very end of it, you can hate me on your own dime, right? So that is the crux. I thought that was a good line by her. That is the crux of the argument. Why should public money, even though it's only $1.60 per American per year, why should any public money go to fund news coverage that isn't accurate? So that was the view of the Reagan administration. That was the view of the Bush administration, et cetera. And it's largely been anger much more at NPR than PBS. So that is what it's about. I think the pushback has always been one that's not entirely true, although nobody's going to argue that every story is perfect, and there have been some issues over the years. But two, there's a lot more provided by public media than just like straight up news coverage, right? There's children's programming, there's all kinds of in-depth reporting, there's all kinds of cultural shows, educational shows. So that's been how those efforts have been fought back. There's also the emergency public broadcast system, which is not a small deal. And so if the money goes away, you know, places are able to get warned about disasters, human or natural, across the emergency public broadcast system, and that is a big part of public media as well. So that's how these efforts always got pushed back.
I think we are at the point where I'm supposed to turn things back over to Marion, where we call for some, where each of us sort of reiterates our call to actions. But before I do that, I would like to thank my stellar panel here for being here. And I think you have illuminated a subject that is near and dear and that people are concerned about. And I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you for your participation today. Marion?
Thank you, Vest, and thank you to the three of you as well for helping us understand so much of this. We do want you to reiterate your calls to action, if you would, because we want our audience to think about what they can do. So if, Susan, could you start?
Sure. Don't take a fair and independent press for granted. Subscribe to any news channel that you believe in, but particularly local news and nonprofit organizations.
Thank you. And Kevin?
Yeah, I'm similar, like support local journalism and through membership, subscriptions, fundraisers, events, and find a way to get involved in your community and the issues that are important to it.
Right. And Jeff?
In general, I think a lot of people are depressed because of things that are happening in this administration. I'd say, and this relates to journalism, don't be depressed, take action. It's joyful. Consider yourself part of a movement, get to know your neighbors. And in terms of this, I totally agree with the idea of helping local journalism. I mentioned before the idea of legal action, which I think can be hugely important, but also get your kids involved. Tell your kids how important journalism is. Make sure that they understand part of civic education is the next generation and its commitment to understand news.
Thank you. And Sylvester?
Well, I agree with all of that. And I especially support your local news organizations. And also, I think, learn as much as you can about how news media works, what freedom of the press is all about, and how that impacts your life. I think the more you know, the better it is for us all.
Thank you. And ClassACT has two things to say to all of you. Make a plan to do some of the things that our four panelists have mentioned just now. Make a plan for yourself. Do something once a week. Do something once a month. Do something every day. Call your Congress people. Talk to your friends. Definitely support your local news outlets and NPR and public broadcasting. Also, ClassACT, this is the beginning of a at least year-long effort on our part to look at freedom of the press and to support the press and press freedoms. And so please stay current with us. We will be sending out press alerts, freedom of the press alerts regularly that will help you figure out other things you can do as we move forward. So I want to thank all of you, Sylvester, Susan, Kevin, and Geoffrey. We so appreciate your sharing your knowledge and your thoughts with us. And as well, I would like to thank our Freedom of the Press program leaders, Jackie Swearingen and Ryan O'Connell, who developed this program with the invaluable help of Sylvester Monroe, who invited his extraordinary colleagues to participate. So we thank you particularly, Vest, as well as our Justice and Civic Engagement leaders, Therese Steiner and Bachman Mosavar-Rahmani. I also want to thank the members of our production team, John Noren, Jackie Swearingen, Sarah Ulrich, Richard Jackma, Diana Labanchu, Kate Freed, Katie Marinello, and videographer Rick Brotman. Thanks in advance go to our breakout room leaders, all of whom are journalists: Ham Fish, Ann McKinnon, Terrence McNally, and Ryan O'Connell. And finally, thank you to all of you who have attended this evening.